Hi guys, welcome to our last unit on plants, video on plants called angiosperms. Angiosperms are vascular seed plants, and as you can tell in our cladogram, the last is the last organism of plants that we're going to study. So just to take you through really quickly, angiosperms will have all of these characteristics. Gymnosperms and angiosperms will have seeds, and so they're very different. They're vascular plants that have seeds and very different than the other vascular plants because they no longer are dependent on water for fertilization, and angiosperms have an extra perk that they have flowers. And here you can see different examples of angiosperms that you might see around campus. We have a lot of these southern magnolia trees, but the majority of the plants that you see today are actually angiosperms. As you can see, over 75% of the plants today are that. So they're very successful in the way in which they are replicating. Okay, angiosperms have some specific traits. They obviously have vascular tissue, they produce seeds and fruits, and this is called the cotyledon, this part of the seed. And if you think about a lima bean and it has kind of like a seam in the middle, that lima bean, you can kind of cut it in half versus a corn kernel that is like a whole kernel. You not really are able to split it. So that is the difference between monocot and eutocot. A monocot is a single seed. A eutocot is when it kind of has a seam. It has other characteristics too, such as different types of leaves with parallel lines. And monocots actually have 3-petal flowers as opposed to 5-petal flowers. You are going to do a dissection of a flower and in a moment, but I wanted to go over a couple of things that I really need you to pay attention to when you are studying. Remember, one key to remember: stamen is the men, so that's the male part. And so the stamen is this little long elongated piece here with the anther and the filament. That's the stamen, the entire thing. The anther is what holds the pollen. And the pistil is this entire section. So the pistil is composed of the stigma, the style, which is the tube, and then the ovary that actually is held down here. And here in the ovary is where the fruit will develop if the plant bears fruit. Couple of things about plants: they can live for 1 year. They're called annuals. Those are the pretty flowers that you plant once a year. They sometimes can live biennial, which means they live for 2 years, and they actually bear flowers in their second year. These would be the smaller type plants. The third style of plants would be the perennials, and they live for longer than 2 years. And typically these are going to be your larger type plants because they have to take a long time to develop and get resources and grow. So some of these angiosperms that are perennial are incredibly old. As a matter of fact, some of the oldest organisms on the planet are angiosperms. Here we have this forest in Pando, and these types of trees are called quaking aspen, and they are over 80,000 years old. And imagine one tree bearing all these little baby trees. So they're clones, they're exact replicas of the original. So as a forest, they're 80,000 years old. The largest known tree is this bristlecone pine, and it's over 5,000 years old. That means that it germinated at around 3000 BC, and that's pretty crazy. It is kept secret, the location of that tree. Right now, I need you to go and pause this video and go do your flower anatomy and come back in a moment because you will need that information in order to continue the reproduction of plants. Make sure you pause the video. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed your flower dissection. I want to take you through this process of vascular seed plants, and I'm going to spend some time trying to break this down into detail for you. So remember that we have both the sporophyte and the gametophyte phases. So this is different than the other. It's if you think about the gymnosperms, this reproduction process is similar to the gymnosperm but different. The sporophyte in this case is the flower. So this is different than in the gymnosperm. In the gymnosperm, the sporophyte would be the cone. And the different types of cones. Remember, sometimes you have the soft cones, sometimes you have the hard cones, if it's female or male. Here, the differences you're going to find is in the anther, you will find the pollen, and in the stigma, you will go down to the ovary. So to first talk about the pollen, so in the anther, you know that all that material that forms on top, they're like little tiny dots. Remember, they're called microspores. They're tiny, tiny grain pollen material that gets transferred into the stigma, right? So this would be the sporophyte, the flower that holds two different parts, two different organs. It holds the anther that makes the microspores for the pollen, and then it holds the stigma that holds the ovary. So in the female, you have the ovule that will actually develop megaspores inside. Remember, they're called megaspores and microspores. So the megaspore will grow and develop inside here, inside the ovary. And when it matures, the pollen will be transferred into the ovule to fertilize the ovary. Now, this now sounds probably to you very similar to what happens in female and male reproductive systems. Remember what I asked you to keep thinking this in comparison. One interesting fact is pollen can be made at different times than the female gametophyte actually matures the egg. So these can happen the pollen grain can be made at different times. What needs to pollinate to make sure that this gets fertilized? You probably thought about it already. You need some sort of aid, wind, but more successfully is going to be insects or animals that are going to bring the pollen and are going to help it, especially insects and birds, and they're going to transfer the pollen in here, and then the pollen is going to slide down and fertilize the egg. Now in this process of fertilization, now we have a fertilized egg. Now we have a diploid cell, right? And then this diploid cell, it's going to start to develop an embryo with a seed coat and a fruit if the fruit is present, right? Once an animal eats that fruit or takes that fruit or dumps that fruit somewhere and the seed falls out, if the conditions are right, it's going to grow a new sporophyte. Now, one thing that we're going to be talking about is these methods of pollination, how these pollen grains get into this ovary is very interesting, because if you have different plants that are of the same species, they would have cross-pollination. So you could have variety here by bringing pollen from a different plant from the other side of your garden into the one on the front of the garden, for example, and pollinate that plant. And so that would give you more diversity. Or it could pollinate the same plant, which then it would make a clone of that, just like we talked about in the forest in Utah. A couple more things is the flower will be protecting the seed, and the fruit will protect the seeds also. So here the seeds are much better protected than in any other types of plants, and winds and pollinators will fertilize all of this process. Okay, so self-pollination. Self-pollination is when the plant is able to pollinate itself, and all that means is that the plant will then take some of its pollen and put it down the stigma, and it will fertilize the egg, and it's going to make an exact copy of the plant. But many of the plants in this, the reason why we think there's so much successfulness is because there's a lot of diversity and a lot of gene pool, and that is caused by the animal pollination. In this case here, you see this Rafflesia is also called the death flower because it mimics the smell of dead organisms. It's in Asia, it's found in Asia, and it attracts flies and other organisms that will then come and pollinate it and go somewhere else, bringing their pollen to another plant. It is the largest flower on the planet. You also have different colors of flowers that attract different pollinators. I'm going to play you a brief video that shows how different animals, or in this case insects, view flowers. So the second is going to be the butterfly vision, and the third is going to be what the bees would see. So this is how humans see the flower. Butterflies and bees. So you can see that organisms look at things very differently than we do and are able to see different colors, which attracts them wanting to go to that organism to be able to pollinate it and look at it. So flowers actually have, or plants have actually evolutionized to the point that they make themselves attractive to these organisms because they depend on them for survival. Okay, now the last slide, I want to talk about certain, pollination, like wind pollination that we talked about already, still occurs in plants that have flowers. In this case, you may know that those plants may not seem very attractive, or you may think about this. They don't need to look attractive. They don't need to call attention because they're really not depending on an animal to seem attractive. Just like certain animals in the wild, like the poison dart frog is bright red, or so that it's warning. Certain flowers will be really colorful to invite, and certain flowers will not be attracted at all because they don't really care what they look like. They're not dependent on those organisms to survive. Rather, they're using the wind. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. Please contact me with any questions. Remember that we have a test on Monday, so any questions are welcome. Have a good day.